Progress monitoring. Okay, so when I say progress monitoring, I always capitalize this. And when I, as a presenter, talk about progress monitoring, what I'm talking about is that formal process of monitoring kids who are in interventions. So I'm coming at this through a lens of MTSS, and I'm talking about that formal process that we go through when we've said this kid needs to go into an intervention, and I need to know, I need to get information about whether that intervention is working for them or not. Again, I always use capital P, capital M. I delineate this from monitoring progress or progress monitoring little p. We're always monitoring kids' progress, but when we put them into an intervention, it becomes a big consequential deal. So I capitalize it, capital P, capital M. This is what progress monitoring looks like in STAR. And again, this is not for all kids. This is for kids that are placed into tier 2 or tier 3 interventions, or that you want to look at more closely. For most kids, they're only going to take STAR fall, winter, and spring. But if you want to monitor more closely the progress of kids who are in interventions, they can take the tests more often. How often? They can take it up to weekly if you want to. There's probably no point in doing that. We merely have that there because some states require that. But when kids are in intervention, if you talk about an intervention that begins in the fall and they're going to stay in there until the winter, which is very common, or you're doing your screening right now and you're going to rearrange who's in interventions, they're going to come in the winter and stay there until the spring. Well, between the fall to the winter or the winter and the spring, what you need is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 STAR tests to create a really reliable trend line. Now, I'm going to come back to this report in just a second to show you how it works. But let me make sure I point out something. Look down the left side where it talks about the STAR, in this case, STAR Math Scaled Score. Whenever you are doing progress monitoring, the unit that you're going to use is scale scores. And here's why. The scale score is the tiniest increment. It's like saying we're going to measure all kids 3 times a year to the nearest inch. And then between that window, we're going to measure kids in intervention to the nearest quarter of an inch. It's a smaller thing. What this animation is designed to show you is there are multiple scale scores that might be associated with the same percentile rank. So being at the 23rd percentile rank might be anywhere between 479 and 485 in this model. In progress monitoring, you want to monitor looking at the scale score, because if you were just monitoring based on percentile ranks, which is larger, if a student rose from 479 to 484 and you were merely looking at percentile ranks, you would not perceive that growth. But because the scale score is the tiniest, smallest increment, you would be able to detect that they've moved from 479 to a 484. So what you see on this report is you see the dots reflecting the scale scores or the STAR test that a student's gotten. Some are yellow and some are blue in this case. That's because the dots on this report reflect the screening categories. Kids that are green are at or above the benchmark you've set. Blue is close. Yellow is a little bit further below. Red is critically below. When we follow Mark's journey from left to right, as he's making his way from the beginning of the school year in September until January, the first thing we might notice is his yellow dots are turning into blue dots. That's moving up. That's great. He's moved from being an intervention to being merely on watch, okay? So you saw the yellow dots across September and October. The black trend line, that is developed based on the multiple STAR test. It animates for you based on these multiple tests. How do we think the student is growing? It takes 4 or more tests to generate that trend line. So if I looked at this in September when I only had 1 test, all I would see is the yellow dot and the green goal line that was set for him. So the goal that you want for a student is set in there. There's a there's a wizard that helps you set a goal within an intervention. So Mark's goal was set there in green. You see that between September and November, he was growing a little bit, but the black trend line that he got, even though it was going up, it was falling further and further behind that growth goal. So you'll also notice those yellow vertical lines that are occurring in there. That tells you when there was an intervention shift. So if you will, let's read this report from left to right. Yellow vertical line tells me that Mark was placed in an intervention in September. A green goal line was set for him. He took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yellow dots between September and November that generated a trend line, the black line that you see there. Mark was growing, but not anywhere near sufficiently to meet the growth goal that was set for him. So sometime in November, he was changed. His intervention changed. I know that because another yellow vertical line appears there. From November to January, he was in a different intervention. He continued to take STAR test. It generated a new trend line in the new intervention, and that black trend line is falling, it's rising above the green goal line that was set for them, which indicates that Mark is responding to the second intervention. This is page 1 of the report, which is what most people look at because it kind of tells the whole story. But on page 2, it details all of that information. What was the type of intervention that Mark was in? What day did that start? What individual days did he sit down and take progress monitoring tests? What scale scores did he achieve? And what type of growth rate was achieved or created or generated for him? So really, this is just the individual metrics behind the image of the story up here. That's a pretty deep one. So let me pause for a minute and see if there's any questions that came in or ones you want. Now, again, this is not all kids. This is only kids who you place into formal interventions. Those kids would take the test more often. And this is the report that's being generated where you are comparing their actual achieved growth to a growth goal that was set for them.
Thank you, Gene. I have a question.
Please.
Hey, I'm Jess Reyes. I'm from this AAO as well with
Hey.
Ritu and Michelle. So this is really helpful to see this graphic. And
Yeah.
I just want to maybe overlay a couple of things just to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly.
Go for
Okay.
it.
So I understand that the vertical lines are the shifts in intervention. And
Yes.
the intervention shifts that are made are based off of teachers' judgment or teachers' review of the trend line compared to the student goal line.
I hesitate to say the teacher's making the decision because there's probably an intervention committee that would have been involved.
Sure.
So it is, let's just say that a formal placement was changed, that we were looking at what was happening between September and November.
Yep.
We were saying, this is not working. This is not what we need. We need something more. So I'm going to change the support experience that this student is having, and we're going to increase it and change it radically and see whether that works for them.
Great. So then basically what we're looking at is a line of best fit
Yes.
based off of the progress monitoring the yellow
Exactly.
dots in the first like segment, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Where we have a lower trajectory as compared to the student goal line that one can derive if the student were to continue in this path, that the goal line would continue to widen compared to the student actual results. And so then an intervention is done in November after a committee of folks comes together to review the data to ascertain whether there's enough growth, right? And then another intervention is provided because the first one wasn't deemed as being as effective based off of the measure, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so now we see a different growth line for the student, a different line of best fit for the second segment that shows that the student is actually exceeding the student goal trend line. And that's essentially what we're looking at this point in time, correct?
Everything you said was absolutely spot on.
Okay, so then my follow-up then really gets into frequency of progress monitoring.
Yes.
The
Good
second
question.
slide, I want to show, I'm glad you're able to show that second slide because I was trying to do the counting myself. But if you don't mind going to the second slide.
Absolutely.
This indicates kind of like a cadence at which the student is being provided the test, right? So we have
Yes,
to
it does.
imagine that between September and November, some frequency of the intervention is happening with the student, and another
Mhm.
frequency is happening with the number of times that the student is taking the test.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, yes.
So it looks like it's about 2 to 3 times a month, or every 2 weeks or so.
It looks about every 2 weeks is what it appears to be on here.
And in your work, is that typical that like 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks is the right cadence for
You know,
students to be tested?
yours is a fabulous question. And what I would say is, let me tell you what's ideal. So this was a mock-up I got from somebody. It came from one of the reports. Here's what we've done when we've studied this. Here's what we found to be best. We have found, well, first of all, the idea of changing an intervention between September and the winter is probably a little bit premature. Most researchers will say, if you're talking about a formal intervention, you're probably going to need about 12 weeks. So I tend to prefer, unless we get a kid in intervention and it just becomes immediately apparent, to say this is just not working, like we know on multiple reasons. So I think that Mark's example here does, when we generalize, it does seem to be a premature move. It may be that it just wasn't working. Like we knew it just wasn't working. And so there was a change that was made. Most kids are going to be in an intervention from September until the winter, and we're going to reevaluate unless something is just glaring at us. Here's what we also found, Jess, because we did an entire study just on progress monitoring. What are people doing, and what practices that people use lead to the best returns for kids? First of all, many people, we could do a whole session on like, what goal are you going to set? Um, the more aggressive a goal the teacher set, the more growth the kids get. I mean, it just plays out that way. We also found that between the fall and the winter, generally speaking, to get a highly reliable trend line, and you were using line of best fit, same thing. Okay, so linear regression model creates that line. It minimizes outliers. It's the power of all those tests pulled together to say what's going on. Ideal best practice we find is somewhere between 4 and 5 tests across the semester. So when we look at Mark's example and we say, Mark's example would be an extreme one. Most kids would be September to January in the same intervention, where they were probably having 4 or 5 tests to generate a trend line and then reevaluate their placement in the middle of the year. For this to have happened for Mark, it needed to have been that it became quickly apparent in the first intervention that this just was the wrong fit, and that to wait until January to make a move was both delaying the inevitable and not getting him the services that he needed. So it is an illustration, but most kids are going to be September to October, 4 or 5 tests, somewhere in between. And also, too, when you think about that first test, if you look at Mark's first yellow line in September, remember that is the same test we take for screening. So everybody
Right.
screens in September. That's test number 1. So we only need 3 more before a trend line will be developed. We suggest 4 more because there's a little bit of bounce in a trend line in with 4 scores versus 5. We find that by the time you've given 5, you've got a highly reliable trend line that you can use to make a very informed decision about intervention placement.
Great. Thank you so much, Gene.
Yeah,
No, thank you. That was
Jean,
really deep. Yeah,
question.
yeah, go for it.
Just a very quick follow-up. So when we show progress monitoring, do we show the trend line or do we show the scale score that is the goal?
Well, a couple things. I would say generally on this report, it's comparing that black trend line, which is what the student actually did, to the green goal line that you've set. And so again, in the first intervention on the left from Mark, we're saying, well, this isn't working. He's growing, but nowhere near fast enough. Like this, he's
So,
only going to fall further and further behind. Go
so
ahead.
when you say the green goal line that you set, that means I have to set it.
Yes. Yes, there is a process when a student enters an intervention. And Michelle's probably got documents. If not, we can do a session on that. You're going to grab a kid's name, and then it'll ask you, what kind of goal do you want to set for the student? We have some best practice recommendations in there. Basically, what you can set is a goal of average growth, in which case you know this kid must exceed that. Or you can set a goal of well above average growth, and if as long as the kid comes close to that, then you could say the intervention is working.
We've actually done that, exactly what you're saying. We used the regression line and we used 1.5 times in terms of the growth that we
Okay.
want. And can we share our logic with you and just have you?
Absolutely, yes. Mhm.
And then how many times do you like we are putting out goals? We want to put out like a score. So we are trying to put out that score to be reached twice a year. one mid-year and then another one end of year.
Mhm.
And do you think that's enough? Because that's also on math.
Well, let me delineate between, are you talking about kids that are in standard service, or are they in intervention service, and you're just kind of parsing
No,
out
I'm talking
the
about every kid.
okay, yeah,
Not
yeah.
intervention.
So what you are able to do now, remember what I said, this is progress monitoring, capital P, capital M. Okay. There are other reports that look like this that you can run for all kids, and they do not have to be in interventions, and you do not have to set
Yes.
this up, and you do not. So there are other reports that we have that will generate a trend line for you, and in the background will show you reference points that are either percentile ranks or benchmark related for you. Okay, so I actually have a blog, and Michelle, I'll try to remember to send this one to you. It talks about different levels of progress monitoring. This is the highest one. This is like the medical analogy of, this kid is sick and I got to have a treatment plan. Okay. That said, there are other reports that you can use that I think are doing what you're talking about. Is, I know I have a benchmark I need the kids to be at by the end of the year. So let me talk about where it is they begin and where I want them to be by the middle of the year, so that by the end of the year, they are where we need them to be. And STAR actually does all of that automatically for you. So on the reports, and actually, I think, you know what? I think I actually have this on the next slide here. Um, let me see. I think I've got a copy here. Just a second.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, there is a report called the State Standards. Let me get the right. I'll mess up the name if I don't put it in front of me. The State Performance Report. There you go. So I think this is what you're asking about. So, all right, let me share the screen again. We moved to Teams, so now I've gotten rusty in Zoom. Y'all know how life is. You get used to one and they move your cheese. All right, so here it is. So see what it looks the same, doesn't it? Kind of real similar, but you didn't have to pull the kid's name. You didn't have to put them in intervention. All that's happening is you're building a testing history for the kid. So what you're seeing on this report, that green line, if you'll read the text down the bottom, that is your pathway to proficiency. This is where you need to be and how you need to rise across the year to be meeting the state benchmarks for that grade level by the end of the year. So in the case of this particular student, we're elated because their testing history, which generates that black trend line that you see there, indicates that they are well above where they need to be on track. That's why, even though the report is called the State Performance Report, a lot of people call it the Pathway to Proficiency Report, because what it's doing is tracking, are your kids on that pathway towards proficiency. But I can send a blog to you that talks about the different, because we're talking about different levels of intensity. You know, we would never want to set up and put every kid into an intervention. That's too much work. It's not worth it. But every now and then I want to do what I think you were asking about, which is, I want to take a snapshot and I want to be comfortable that these kids are progressing throughout the year as they should.
Yes.
So by the end of the year, they will be where I need them to be. That makes sense?
Yes. Yes. Because, we have a student outcome focused governance, and
Yes.
we have to set progress monitoring um, goals for each student mid-year and end of year.
Yep, that can help you do that. And we have some external documents as well. Let me show you one other thing and we'll get ready to wrap up here. I had a lot more to show you, but best laid plans, mice and men, all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about how all of this is linked. So you probably have a copy of this already, and I hope it's still showing. Do you see the state performance now? I gotta go back and share, my bad. All right, so this is the California linking study. So it is the statistical linking that we went through to tie STAR to your state test. In other words, how high of a score does a kid need on STAR reading or STAR math
Right.
to be performing the level that you need to know that they will be successful on the state test? This involves, in California, it'd be more than this. We will not do the linking study unless we can get matched records for at least 1,000 kids per grade level. In California, you had way more than that, but you can understand, like in North Dakota or Montana, that might be kind of hard. So these were the correlation coefficients where we were statistically linking scores on, in this case, STAR math to smarter balanced outcomes. And you see those correlation coefficients there, 0.84, 0.87. These are really, really solid, really, really good kind of predictions there. You can also see the idea there, what would be the classification accuracy? In other words, in grade 3, 85% of the time, the proficiency level that was predicted by STAR was the actual proficiency level of the student. Now, you always love it to be higher, but for two tests, for one test to predict another test, this is really good. You also see that reflection down there of area under the curve. That website that I showed you early on, that if you go to this is reflected in the screening tools that you see there, because basically that's what a screening tool has to do. The screening tool has to be able to highly predict the outcomes that you want, which in your case is a certain performance level on the California state test. So if you go there, what you're going to see is virtually perfect ratings for STAR across the board in doing statistically what we need to do. The result then is the proficiency levels that you see on the screening report, green, at or above where they need to be, and these adjust. So we don't expect that in September, a kid has the scale score they need in March, but what we do is we say where they are, if they just grow at a normal rate, will they be okay? So if they're 20 points below and they're going to grow at 2 points a week for 20 weeks and they're going to get to that level, they're green. That's good. A little bit further below is blue. A little bit further below that is yellow. Critically below is red. So these do adjust automatically. So what you are doing manually, we're also doing automatically for you behind the scenes, both on your screening report and on that state performance report. And I thought I had a metric in there. There's actually a table. I may have done it as a hidden slide. There is a table within this report that says these are the actual scale scores that you're looking for. So what do you want? What scale score do you want a kid to have in March or April when the state test occurs? What score do they need to achieve by then to have a high likelihood of passing that test when it occurs? And again, I'll send the link to that document. It's all, and again, you can have the document, but it's all working in the background. So the other thing that we probably do want to talk through is I want to make sure that you're not trying to do things manually that we're already doing automatically for you.
That's what
Let's save time. Let's save time and make sure that, because we've done all that so that you don't have to do all of that manual work. So we can do a little check and a little sharing to make sure that you're not, just doing things you don't have to do. So I had more on focus skills, but we are at time. So Michelle, I'll bounce it back to you. And, I'm going to follow up, get you the slides, I'll get the link to the study, that kind of stuff. And if we want to come back another time and either cover the things I didn't get through today or go deeper in anything we did, we are happy to do that at any time. And we so appreciate you all spending your time, your lunchtime
We appreciate
today.
you more. That's so well done.
No. This is my job. This is my job to talk you all through this, make you feel good about it, and save you time. So there are no thanks necessary. We're more than happy to do it.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for joining us today, and thank you to all the participants as well.